his name.
Now there will be violence. I'm angry. I'm furious, in fact, and that's not entirely bad, because I would rather be furious than sad. I'm angry about what has happened in the States. I'm angry on behalf of the family. I'm angry on behalf of the community, but it's not enough. I'm also angry at the people exploiting this. I'm angry that our communities are now so widely spread apart that we can no longer communicate. That if you look at left Twitter, you see one entirely divorced from reality version of events, and then if you look at right Twitter, you'll see another entirely divorced from reality set of events. We're not even living in the same world anymore, and this is only exacerbated and made far more terrible by the very people who claim to be fighting against this kind of prejudice, to be fighting against racism and privilege and all of these other evils in the world, yet within moments of proudly proclaiming themselves to be against racism, to be against sexism, to be against any kind of ism you care to mention, really, within moments of them having paraded their virtue, they will turn on someone for being white, for being male, for whatever else it might be. There's an essential hypocrisy to this, which is why we're not getting anywhere. There was one glorious moment in the 90s where things seemed to be roughly on the right track, in the wake of a whole lot of similar shit that was going down then, but after the death of political correctness, where it all seemed that we were on the same page, that equality was what we all wanted, and we were all prepared to fight for and make sacrifices for. And then that just melted away through the 2000s into the 2010s, and now we find ourselves back here. And it is as much the fault of the people who claim to be against bigotry and prejudice as it is anybody else. I want to actually solve these problems, right? I want to make the world genuinely a better place, and we cannot do that. We cannot hope to do that while people are being divisive on matters of race. And one of the most insidious, vile, repugnant, masochistic, and all too often excused forms of racial prejudice is this idea of white privilege. And you hear this out of the mouths of people who claim to be against racism and prejudice. Somehow that's different. They'll even redefine terms so they can get away with it. It doesn't really exist. And this racialization plays into the hands of the far right. Let's break it down then. Alright, and unusually for me, let's include some statistics and sources, which I don't normally do because no fucker will listen, and I want you to do your own research so you believe it. Let's define some terms to start with, right? So we're all on the same page and we're all speaking the same fucking language. What's race? Race is a largely meaningless distinction, save at real extremes, like Olympics, that sort of standard, or extreme medical circumstances. But it's important culturally in a lot of people's eyes for some reason, even though it's practically meaningless, and it's largely based around what skin colour someone has. And we have stereotypes around that. So that's race, right? And white is considered one of these races, even though black is subdivided into multiple races, white is subdivided into multiple races, yellow, if you will, is subdivided into multiple races. Never mind. It's America. They like to keep things simple because they're dumb as fuck. Privilege. Privilege is not advantage. A privilege is something given to you by law. It's de jure, right? Not de facto. Apartheid was an example of privilege. Segregated America in the 1950s, prior to the Civil Rights Movement, that was an example of privilege. The current way in which certain laws will allow you to discriminate against, say, for example, white men and prioritise people from minorities, that's an example of privilege, but going the opposite way to the way you think. Privilege has the power of law. The police have privilege. They can speed to apprehend a suspect. They're allowed to use lethal and non-lethal force in a way that average citizens aren't. These are privileges. Having a slightly easier time of it, which we're going to contest anyway, is not a form of privilege. And the kinds of people you want to reach out to understand that they don't have privilege. So when you accuse them of it, when you hold them accountable for things that had absolutely nothing to do with them, you have to understand that you necessarily get their back up and make them resistant to any other point you might want to make. Saying that a group is underprivileged, even though that's not accurate either, makes it far easier to appeal to people to fight for equality and justice, because you're implying that someone else is going to be raised up rather than someone else being torn down. What's racism? Racism is prejudice on the basis of race. That is it. Nothing else. Power relationships don't matter. Any race can be racist towards any other race. Context doesn't matter. And you can even have positive forms of racism, where it's just a stereotype that you hold completely unjustifiably about one group or another based on something irrelevant like the colour of their skin. That's racism. That's prejudice on the basis of race. Now, some people will object, but these are the definitions that I'm using here. You'll say, for example, that you're not saying that white privilege means that white people can't have it hard, it just means that they don't have the same problems as someone who is black. That if you were poor and black, you somehow have some kind of compounded problem there. That's the kind of objection that you're going to make. But the fact of the matter is that the way this term is used, it's used to just condemn white people and say that they don't have it hard. If nothing else in this reaches you, understand that this is tactically a catastrophically bad term to throw around. You will also say that racism depends on structures of power. It does not. Look at the marches held by racists. Look at those people. Look at the kinds of people flying Confederate flags out the back of their truck, right? These are not empowered, powerful people. These are disenfranchised. You should have more in common with them than you have against them, and yet we've been divided on this pointless charade of race so that we don't have that common class consciousness. And you're playing into it. You're making it worse. You're confusing your middle class bourgeois privilege, in inverted commas, for white privilege. It's not. Racism doesn't have to be expressed in the form of negative stereotypes. It can be expressed in the form of positive or powerful stereotypes and tropes as well. This idea of white privilege is an example of that, but let me just rub your nose in it a little bit more. Consider the interwar years, the 1930s, and the kinds of prejudice that erupted around Jewish people in Nazi Germany at the time. What were the stereotypes of the Jews that the Germans were putting forward? That they were conniving, that they were clever, that they held power that was undeserved, that they had wealth that was undeserved. They were described as a powerful, conspiratorial force that was holding everyone else down or controlling their society. These are not stereotypes of weakness. These are not stereotypes of inferiority. But nonetheless, they led to a mass extermination of people. Supposedly positive stereotypes can be used in a negative way. And if you're still not understanding it, consider how, say, considering that all Asians are good at maths is also a stereotype, is also racist, even though it's a positive form of racism. Or that all black people have rhythm, or that white people are privileged. Sure, I'm British. You're going to say that I can't possibly understand the American experience, let alone the black African American experience. But distance can bring perspective. And I'm here to tell you that all of those negative stereotypes that the far right associates with black people in the States are virtually identical to the negative stereotypes around poor people in the rest of the world, and particularly Britain, where we're very much focused on class. All of those negative stereotypes, large families, welfare queens, lazy, shiftless, all of that are equally applied to hoodies, to chavs, to council estates, where people are multi-generationally stuck on welfare through no fault of their own. All of those same stereotypes exist. The undeserving poor goes back throughout history. These same negative stereotypes have even been held in the States about Irish people or Italians, right? In past periods. You constantly and infuriatingly confuse race issues with class issues. And so long as you continually confuse and conflate the two, you cannot address the underlying problem, which is poverty. If you attack race issues that largely exist only in your own head, while ignoring class and wealth issues, you only sow discord, and you can't solve the underlying problem so long as you keep doing that. It's like Trump taking chloroquine for COVID. It has fuck all to do with it. It might make him feel better, but it's only going to probably make things worse for him. Now, handily, Will Shetterly has a blog that delves into many of the same sources and statistics that I draw on to support my interpretation of what's going on. So let's just quote him for a little bit here. Police killings are racially proportionate to US poverty. 2 times more white Americans than black are in poverty, and 2 times more white Americans than black are killed by police each year. Because poor white and poor black people are equally likely to be killed, police killings aren't part of a race war, they're part of a class war. People who reduce the problem to race only see that the police kill a racially disproportionate number of black Americans, which is undeniable. Black people are 13.3% of the US, but 25% of people killed by the police are black. But if you look at the intersection of race and poverty, it becomes obvious that police killings are racially proportionate to American poverty. In 2014, the Kaiser Foundation reported 20 million white Americans and 10 million black Americans were in poverty, a ratio of 2 to 1. PolitiFact noted, over the span of more than a decade, 2,151 whites died by being shot by police, compared to 1,130 blacks, a ratio of 2 to 1. There's a risk that we ignore the oppressions and depredations visited upon the white community, the poor white working class community, because we demonize them and hold them accountable for things in history. The kinds of things that happen in the black community are not unique to the black community. Look up Robert Cameron Reedus, Derek Cruz, Christopher Roop, Christiana Coignar, Autumn May Steele, David Kasich, Brenda Sewell. There are more and more and more, but they don't garner the same kinds of media attention. Now, how do we reduce this? Basic income is the fastest way to reduce police violence. There was a pilot program of basic income in Namibia, and during that pilot program, crime fell by 42%. If we attack the genuine underlying cause, which is poverty, we can make a world where the police will exist to protect and serve everyone. The problem is poverty, not race. And it's obvious the moment you delve into the statistics that's not it. To think that it's race is such a simplistic, childish understanding of what is going on. And again, it plays into the hands of the far right. And so long as we continue to ignore that white trash communities are suffering just as much and in many of the same ways, and we pass them over because inconveniently they're white and historically there has been racism, then you just play into the hands of the far right. You get more Trumps, you get more Boris Johnsons. You have to address them, you have to meet them. One commentator on Facebook, when I tried to raise this point, albeit in an abbreviated form, gave me a handy list of supposed instances of white privilege. Being followed around a store. Well, try being a hoodie in a UK mall. Try being a member of a subculture with a bad reputation in UK stores. Try being poor and obviously poor in a shell suit or a tracksuit in UK stores. Apparently, you can talk your way out of traffic tickets if you're white. Not if you're poor. Not if your appearance is not commensurate to the car that you're driving. You can argue with cops. I've been part of and alongside protests of white people against things like bypasses and so on back in the 90s. Those cops did not hold off. They do not hold off on hippies. They do not hold off on travellers who are predominantly white. I could go on with these, but there's no point. Right? This person, like many people, is mistaking their bourgeois middle class status for being white. So not only are they conflating blackness with poverty, racist in and of itself, but they're conflating their supposedly elevated position with race, when it's all to do with wealth and class. Now there is a valid counter-argument here. If it's all to do with poverty, why is the black community or the minority ethnic community as a whole, why are they so disproportionately poor? Well, there's a whole host of reasons. More of them will be immigrants, that's a big part of the reason, starting from nothing. But the big reason is the lack of social mobility, especially in the US, which is especially ironic because America holds itself up as this big example of being a place where anyone can make it. Well, anyone can make it anywhere, even North Korea, if they have the right connections or they're incredibly lucky. But the sheer brute fact of the matter is that if you're born poor in the States, you're more likely to stay poor than 26 other countries, most of which are pretty socialist. Now, why is that? It's because of social investment and investment in things like education and so on. These provide people the most egalitarian and best start in life that maximizes their opportunities and maximizes their chance of breaking free of the social stratum into which they are born. The US, despite its protestations otherwise about the American dream and so on, is incredibly economically and socially static. People do not find it easy to rise through the ranks in America. Social mobility is abysmal for a first world country in the States. The upshot of which, the long-term result of which, is that if you're poor, you're gonna stay poor. And a few individual exceptions don't change that. And this is true regardless of race. Historically, there was racism. And currently, there's a larger proportion of immigrants starting from nothing within the black and minority ethnic communities. But the lack of social mobility also affects white people. If you try to address it on the basis of race, you are only going to drive more divisions and jealousies and hatreds between each other. If you want to solve these problems, you have to properly diagnose them, and the proper diagnosis is poverty. Holding white people accountable for the actions of a tiny minority of their ancestors is not justice, it's revenge, and it's not even revenge on the people who wronged you, or not even wronged you, wronged your ancestors. Why are we playing the far-right game? Why are we playing the game of the people in power? Why are we playing this game of divide and conquer? A poor white person and a poor black person has far more in common than they have that sets them apart. They share a common status of oppression and deprivation, and if they would work together, it would be far more effective than this division on racial lines. And like I said, if you step in and you start giving money and preferential treatment to a racial minority, you're only going to deepen the hatred and the jealousy. You need to shut the fuck up about white privilege, because there is no such fucking thing, and it confuses your message and makes you sound like an appalling racist. people can get on board with equality. People can get on board with the idea that racism is bad, but not if you make exceptions. And there is no point attacking the racism that is there, that does exist, when far and away the biggest source of division and prejudice and police brutality is poverty.
And this is not a time to be dismayed. This is punk rock time. This is what Joe Strummer trained you for. It is now time to go. You're a good person. That means more now than ever.